The auctioneer's hammer came down hard on the wooden block, and the sound cracked across the open fjord market like a stone splitting ice. Clyde Hale stood on the raised platform at the edge of the Veldmar trading post with his wrists bound in front of him by a rough length of hemp rope, the knot loose enough to be an insult, as if even the cord didn't think he'd run. Around him, the morning fog was burning off the fjord, and the gray water below the highland cliffs caught the first pale sunlight like hammered tin. The market smelled of salted fish, pine resin, and the particular sour sweat of a crowd that had gathered for entertainment as much as commerce. He had not planned on being merchandise today. 3 days ago he had been a free man with a trade. Clyde was a well digger by profession, one of the best in the Stoneback Valley, people said, though people rarely said it to his face. He was 28 years old, lean and hard from years of digging through rock and clay, with calloused hands and a quiet manner that most folk mistook for dim-wittedness, until they watched him sink a shaft through 40 feet of granite without losing the line by so much as a thumb's width. He had a bedroll, a good set of iron augers, a mule named Bracket, and not much else. He had never minded that. Mules were reliable companions and the work was honest. What he did not have was 40 silver marks, which was the sum Aldrich Pend had demanded when Clyde made the mistake of signing a labor debt contract in the town of Sorin, without reading the clause about interest compounding at the rate of 1 mark per fortnight for every fortnight unpaid. He had read the work clause and the pay clause, and assumed the rest was boilerplate. It was not. By the time Pend's collector found him at the Veldmar market, where he had come to resell a water divining contract and earn enough to clear most of the original debt, the sum had ballooned beyond anything Clyde could dig his way out of in a reasonable season. Pend's collector, a square-jawed man named Rook with no sense of humor and a signed legal transfer document from the Sorin magistrate's office, had invoked the labor bond clause on the spot. Under Sorin law, a defaulted labor bond could be transferred by open auction to any willing buyer, the proceeds going toward the debt, the laborer bound by indenture to the buyer for the contracted period. That period, Clyde now knew, was 1 year. So here he stood. The auctioneer, a reedy little man in a green vest named Fossick, had introduced him with more enthusiasm than dignity. Able-bodied well-digger. 28 years, sound teeth, no documented illness, certified by the Stoneback Guild of Waterworks. Can sink a shaft 60 feet in heavy clay, 40 in granite, 20 in bedrock with the right equipment. Strong back, light rations, first rate in a dry season. Bidding opens at 12 silver. The crowd had found this amusing. The men laughed. The women shook their heads. Several highland farmers placed bids, calling out flat, businesslike numbers. 12, 15, 18. Clyde had stood there with his jaw clenched and his eyes fixed on the middle distance, refusing to look at the people putting prices on his back. He was not afraid of work. He was afraid of who he'd end up working for. Rook had warned him. Pend deals with everyone in this valley. Human clans, border lords, even the orc holds up in the highlands. If the price is right, the bond goes to whoever bids highest. Clyde had assumed that meant some dour highland farmer with 40 acres of barren soil that hadn't seen a good well in a decade. He had not considered the alternative now standing at the edge of the crowd. He noticed her because the crowd noticed her first. A ripple of silence moved through the gathered bodies from the far left, spreading inward the way quiet spreads when something commanding enters a space that had not expected to be commanded. Several men stepped sideways. A couple of women pulled children closer, not in fear exactly, but in the instinctive way people move when something larger and more formidable than themselves comes too close. She walked through the gap the crowd made for her without acknowledging it. That was the thing Clyde fixed on first. She did not push through or demand the space. She simply moved, and the space appeared, because the people who saw her understood immediately that arguing about it would be a waste of effort. Shagrol Darkwolf was tall, a full head and a half taller than most of the human men in the market, with the broad-shouldered, deep-chested build of Orc highland blood that spoke of generations bred for cold mountain air and hard country. Her skin was a warm, deep olive green, the color of moss on wet stone in good light, and where the morning sun caught her jaw and cheekbones, it turned almost bronze. Her tusks were modest, shorter than the bulwarks of the war clans, curving just past her lower lip, polished to an ivory gleam that suggested she kept them deliberately maintained. Her hair was black and heavy, braided back from her face in a single practical rope that fell between her shoulder blades, threaded through with a cord of red-dyed leather, the Darkwolf clan color, though Clyde didn't know that yet. Her face was striking in a way that was not soft and not harsh but simply strong. A wide jaw, high cheekbones, a broad nose with a faint scar running from its bridge to her left cheek, and dark amber eyes that moved across the platform with the calm, measuring look of someone who had learned long ago not to show surprise. She was wearing fitted warrior's leathers, a deep charcoal brown bodice of cured elk hide, laced tight from the waist to just below the collarbone, shaped to her frame in a way that was wholly functional, and yet made no attempt to hide the fact that her frame was worth looking at. Her shoulders were covered by short pauldrons of the same leather reinforced with river-hammered iron studs, and her arms were bare from mid-bicep down, revealing forearms corded with muscle and marked with two thin clan tattoos on her left wrist, inked in the dark blue dye the Highland Orc clans used for blooding rites. She wore riding trousers of the same charcoal leather tucked into knee-high boots of heavy black hide, and at her belt she carried a short iron-headed hand axe on her right hip and a long hunting knife on her left. She looked like what she was, the daughter of a war clan chief, dressed for a market day that might turn into something else entirely, and comfortable with either possibility. She stopped at the edge of the platform and looked at Clyde Hale with those amber eyes and did not look away. He looked back. He had been in enough tight situations that he had learned not to flinch at being looked at, even when the looking was done by someone who could likely put him through the platform boards without raising her voice. He met her gaze steadily, and after a moment, something shifted at the corner of her mouth, not a smile, not quite, but the ghost of one, like she had expected him to look away and found it interesting that he hadn't. 20 silver, called a farmer from the back. 22. Someone countered. Fossick the auctioneer was working himself into the rhythmic patter of his trade, pointing back and forth across the crowd with his hammer like he was conducting something. Shagrol Darkwolf did not look away from Clyde. She tilted her head a fraction of an inch, as if making a decision she had largely already made, and then she raised her hand. 40 silver, she said. Her voice was low and even, carrying easily across the market without effort. It was the voice of someone who had never needed to shout to be heard. The crowd went very quiet. Fossick's hammer froze in mid-swing. He looked at her with wide eyes, and then at his ledger, and then at Rook the collector, who had gone slightly pale but who also clearly recognized that 40 silver was the full debt value plus surplus, and that he would be a fool to turn it down. 40 silver, Fossick echoed. He looked around the crowd. Any advance on 40 silver, silence. The Highland farmers were not foolish enough to enter a bidding war with the Darkwolf clan over a well-digger, regardless of how much they needed water. Sold, Fossick said weakly and brought the hammer down. Shagrol Darkwolf stepped up onto the platform without being invited. She was carrying a leather purse that she passed to Rook without ceremony, and when Rook counted out the coins and nodded, she turned to Clyde. This close, she was even more formidable. The top of his head reached the base of her throat, and the warmth coming off her was the animal warmth of someone very strong and very alive. She looked at the rope on his wrists, reached down and pulled the knot loose with one tug. It fell away. I did not buy rope, she said quietly. I bought work. Clyde rubbed his wrists and looked at her steadily. Well, he said, because something in him had decided that this was the shape his day was taking and there was no benefit in arguing with shapes. What do you need, Doug? The corner of her mouth moved again. This time it was definitely the beginning of a smile, though she killed it before it reached her eyes. "Everything," she said. "Come." She turned and walked off the platform, and the crowd made the space for her again, and Clyde Hale followed the woman who had just bought him, because in the Veldmar Valley on a fog-burning morning, with the fjord going silver below the cliffs, that was simply the most honest thing left to do. His mule bracket was tied to a post at the market edge, loaded with his gear augers, rope, the divining rods he made himself from river-forked hazel, a canvas roll of tools, a change of clothes, and the small iron flask he kept filled with clean water as a matter of professional habit. He untied the mule and fell into step behind Shagrol, who was leading a massive highland horse the color of dark smoke, a thick-necked, deep-haunched animal with iron shoes and braided mane cords. 3 other orcs waited at the edge of the market. They were warriors, 2 men and a woman, all in Darkwolf leathers, all watching Clyde with the flat, neutral assessment that professional fighters give to unknown quantities. None of them spoke to him. He did not take it personally. He was new property as far as they were concerned, and it was their chief's daughter who had spent the clan's silver on him. The road from Veldmar up into the highlands was a narrow track of packed stone and gravel that switchbacked along the fjord cliffs for the first mile before turning inland through a forest of black pine and mountain ash. The morning was cold and clean, and the fjord stretched out far below them, silver and flat, with fishing boats moving slowly in the distance. Clyde walked beside his mule and watched the landscape and said nothing, because saying nothing seemed more honest than saying the wrong things. After about 20 minutes on the road, Shagrol dropped back from the front of the group until she was riding beside him. "Your name," she said. It was not quite a question. "Clyde Hale." "You, Shagrol Darkwolf." "Darkwolf," he repeated. "Chief's clan." She glanced down at him. "My father leads the hold." "Yes," a pause. "You know of us. Only by name. Word gets around about water in a dry valley and about clans that will come to a human market. Most of your kind would not say it so plainly." "Most of my kind are polite liars," he said. "I'm a poor liar and not particularly polite, so I find honesty saves time." She considered that for a moment. "The Darkwolf hold has 30 longhouses and 400 people in the high fjord. We have 3 wells. 2 have gone bad, salt seep from the rock, which has been moving over the past 5 years. The 3rd is still clean, but it serves too many, and in summer it runs shallow." "How deep are the current wells?" 20 feet, 30 feet, and 42 feet. He nodded slowly. "Salt seep at 20 and 30. If the rock layer is shifting, the seam's probably running diagonal from the northwest, given how these highlands sit. The 42-footer might have another decade in it or might go bad next season depending on how fast the seam moves." He looked at the cliffs rising ahead of them, reading the striations in the exposed stone the way he had spent 10 years learning to read stone. "You need new shafts, sunk deeper, placed differently. I'll need to walk the hold and test the ground." "That is why I bought you," she said. "Fair enough." He paused. "What happens if I dig and don't find clean water?" "Then we will have lost 40 silver and you will have dug very long holes." She said it with a dryness that surprised him into a short laugh. She looked at him when he laughed. It was a brief, involuntary look of assessment, quick and unguarded, and then she faced the road again. But something had shifted in her posture just slightly. The Darkwolf hold materialized from the pine forest about 2 hours into the highlands, appearing first as the smell of wood smoke and cooked meat, then as the sound of voices and metal on metal, and then as the thing itself. A cluster of 12 longhouses arranged in a horseshoe shape around a central yard, backed against the cliff face of the upper fjord, and overlooking a wide, gray-green valley that dropped away for miles below. The longhouses were built from massive black pine logs with turf roofs and carved lintel posts, and the central yard was packed earth with a forge at one end, a stone meat-smoking rack at the other, and a community well at the center. The 3rd well, the 42-footer, from which a steady line of women and young orcs were drawing water in clay jugs. Clyde stopped at the edge of the yard and looked at the well and then at the surrounding rock, and then at the way the cliff face ran behind the hold, and he felt the particular working excitement that came over him when he read ground that had a story to tell. "Give me the day to walk it," he said. Shagrol had dismounted and handed her horse to one of the warriors. She looked at him. "You may have 3 days if you need them." He shook his head. "One day. I work fast." He walked the hold and the land behind it for most of that day. He used his hazel rods on the flats east of the forge, and the rods moved where he expected them to move, which was good. He found what he was looking for near the eastern cliff face, where the stone stepped down in a low shelf about 60 yards from the nearest longhouse, a wet seam where the cliff face sweated even in dry weather, the stone always faintly damp, the moss growing thick and dark. He tested the shelf with his iron probe rod and found the rock layer approximately 3 feet down, and beneath it, water moving quietly through the mountain. He ate that evening in the Darkwolf longhouse, seated at the common table with the warriors and the working people of the clan, and the meal was venison stew and black bread, and a strong grain mash from clay cups. Nobody spoke to him at first. He ate steadily and kept his eyes on his food, and listened to the rhythms of a community he did not know. Eventually the man on his left, a heavy-set older orc with one eye and a gray-streaked beard, spoke to him in passable common tongue. "You are the well man from the market." "I am." "Shagrol bought you for 40 silver. She did. That is a great deal of silver for a human. I dug a well last season in the Sorin Flats that gave clean water for 60 families through a 3-month drought," Clyde said mildly. "Price seems reasonable to me." The one-eyed orc turned this over, then nodded as if it were a fair answer. "I am Dirk. I keep the forge." "Clyde Hale. I keep the water running." Dirk looked at him for a moment and then laughed, a big, barrel-chested sound, and clapped him on the shoulder hard enough to rock him sideways. "Good man," he said. "Have more stew." Shagrol was at the far end of the table, seated at the high end near a weathered chair that Clyde understood was the chief's place, though the chief, her father, was not present. She was eating without looking at him, but he noticed that twice she glanced his way, a quick amber look that checked the room the way a commander checks her flanks without showing she is doing it. He met the second glance, and this time she held it for a beat longer before returning to her food. He was given a bunk in the storage end of the forge building, curtained off from the metalwork, with a straw mattress, a wool blanket, and a peg for his coat. It was clean and warm and frankly better than some of the places the road had given him. He lay on his back and listened to the fjord wind moving through the pines, and thought about the wet seam in the eastern cliff, and how deep he'd need to go to clear the salt rock entirely. He thought briefly about Shagrol Darkwolf's amber eyes and the way she had pulled the rope off his wrists, and then he stopped thinking about it because that was a thing a man didn't chase, not when he was a bonded laborer on another person's land. He closed his eyes and slept soundly. In the morning he presented his findings. He laid it out in the central yard with a sharpened stick drawing lines in the dirt, explaining the salt seam movement, the estimated trajectory, the depth of the clean water beneath the eastern shelf, and the recommended placement of 2 new shafts, one at 60 feet and one he thought could go shallower, around 45 feet, because of a secondary seam he'd found near the smoking rack. He recommended leaving the 42-foot well in operation for now, but monitoring it monthly with a salt test stone. He said it plainly and without ornamentation. When he looked up, a dozen orc workers and warriors were watching him, and Shagrol was standing at the front of the loose circle with her arms folded across her chest and an expression of clear, focused attention on her face. When he finished, she said, "How long?" 60 feet through granite in highland cliff rock. 12 to 15 days for the first, depending on what I hit. The second shaft is shallower and the rock looks softer, maybe 8 days. And you can work alone. He looked at the eastern cliff face, then at the crowd around him. "I'll dig faster with a partner on the pulley line for the spoil bucket, someone strong." A pause. Then Shagrol said, "I will pull." It took him a half-second longer than it should have to respond. "All right," he said. He should have known from how she'd handled the market and the road that Shagrol Darkwolf did not give work she wasn't willing to do herself. But watching her the next morning take hold of the rope on the spoil pulley, arms bare again, sleeves pushed back, the leather of her bodice catching dust, and pull an 80-pound bucket of granite spoil up 60 feet of rope with a smooth, even rhythm that barely changed the expression on her face, that clarified something. He dug from the bottom of the shaft, working the iron auger into the stone by hand, using a heavy mallet to drive the bit through the harder seams, shattering loosened rock with an iron bar and loading the spoil into the bucket. It was brutal, grinding work in a space barely wide enough for his shoulders. He sent the bucket up on a whistle signal, and she hauled it clear and tipped it and sent it back down, and they worked in that rhythm all morning without speaking, because there was nothing to say that the work didn't already cover. By midday, they had gone 11 feet. He climbed up the shaft by the knotted rope guide line and sat on the edge with his legs hanging in and drank water from his flask, and she sat across from him on a slab of spoil rock with her own water skin, and they were both covered in fine gray granite dust. "You know what you're doing," she said. It was observation, not flattery. "Same to you," he said. "Most people wear out on the pulley line by the third bucket. You didn't slow." "I do not slow," she said simply. "I noticed." She looked at him with those amber eyes in that direct way she had, not coy, not aggressive, just completely unguarded in her attention, and he thought that was one of the more startling things about her. Most people, when you looked at them straight, looked away or shifted or made something of the eye contact. Shagrol simply looked back as if it were the most natural thing in the world to give a person her full, honest attention. "Why did you bid on me?" he asked, because he had been wondering, and he was not the kind of man to let a question fester. "I told you, the hold needs water. You could have hired any digger in the valley. You didn't need to go through a bond auction." She was quiet for a moment. "Then the guild diggers would not come up here. 3 turned down payment to work for the orc hold. 2 others quoted prices that were," she paused, finding the word, "designed to be refused. When I heard there was a guild man on the block, it was simpler." He understood that completely. He had seen guild men turn down the orc contracts for years, and the reasons they gave were always practical but never honest. "How many times have you been to Veldmar market?" "Many. My father sends me for trade. Some come to see the orc woman at the human market." "For curiosity." "For insult," she said flatly and without self-pity. "It does not stop. I stopped minding it." "I don't believe that last part," he said. She looked at him sharply. "You are bold for a man in bonds." "I'm not in bonds." "You took the rope off." He said it lightly. "And I'm not being bold. I'm being honest, because dishonesty wastes time and we have 60 feet of granite to account for." The sharp look held for another beat, and then it softened, not much but enough that he caught it. "No," she said finally. "I have not stopped minding it, but it is easier not to show it." "I know that one," he said quietly. She looked at him with something new in her expression, a question. He didn't fill it in for her, but he held the look and let her read whatever was there, because there wasn't a safe or dishonest version of his face to offer instead. They went back to digging. On the 5th day into the shaft, his auger bit into a seam of unexpectedly hard quartzite and snapped. He climbed up and swore with more feeling than volume, crouching over the broken tool, and Shagrol crouched beside him, and they both looked at the useless iron head. "Do you have another?" she asked. "Spare bit, yes. The shank's the problem." He turned the broken piece in his hands. "Dirk's forge could recast the shank if he has the right stock iron." "He does." She stood. "Come, I will ask him." Dirk looked at the broken shank, and made the sound a craftsman makes when someone else's tool breaks, and said he could recast it by morning. While they waited, Clyde spent the afternoon walking the second site near the smoking rack, taking measurements, and Shagrol walked with him, which he had not expected. "You do not need to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "Tell me what you are looking for." So he told her about reading the way water moved through stone, about the signs of moisture in the substrate, about how the mountain held its water the same way a living body held its blood, in channels and pools and slow seeping movement. He had never tried to explain it to anyone before. He found, explaining it to her, that she asked the right questions, not many, but exact, targeted questions that told him she was following the logic of it rather than just being polite. "You love this," she said at one point. He stopped mid-sentence and thought about it honestly. "I suppose I do. Most people look at rock and see something in the way. I look at it and see what it's hiding." She looked at the cliff face for a moment. Then, "I feel the same about the hold. Most people see rough walls and cold longhouses. I see everything that keeps 400 people alive through a highland winter." She paused. "My father says I have no poetry, that I only understand things by keeping them alive." "That's not a bad way to love something," Clyde said. She turned her head and looked at him again. The late afternoon sun was coming off the fjord far below, and it caught her face at an angle that made her tusks gleam pale and her amber eyes go the color of winter honey, and he looked at her the way he looked at stone that had something valuable in it, honestly, without trying to look away. "No," she said quietly. "Perhaps it is not." The next morning Dirk had the shank recast, and Clyde went back down the shaft with the repaired auger, and Shagrol took the pulley rope again, and they fell back into the rhythm of it. He found clean water at 58 feet, 3 clean, powerful seeps where the rock opened into a natural fracture, the water running cold and clear and tasting of the deep mountain. He sent up the signal 3 sharp whistle blasts and heard her shout something in Orcish above, and then the hold echoed with the sound of voices, and she was calling down to him in common tongue. "How much? How strong?" "Strong enough," he called back. "This hold won't be dry in my lifetime or yours." He could hear her telling the others. He could hear the sound of it spreading, the particular sound a piece of good news makes when it moves through a tight community that has been living with the shadow of a bad thing for a long time. He sat at the bottom of the shaft in the dark with water rising cold around his boot heels and the clean stone smell of 40 years of mountain pressing in around him, and he felt deeply and quietly satisfied. When he came up the shaft, Shagrol was waiting at the top. She reached down and took his forearm in her grip and pulled him the last 4 feet clear of the shaft mouth as if he weighed nothing at all, setting him on his feet on the rock beside her. She did not let go of his arm immediately. She looked at him, dusty, wet to the knees, with granite grit in his hair and water from the deep seep dripping from his hands, and she said, "Well done, Clyde Hale." It was the first time she had used his name. He was very aware of her hand on his forearm. He was also very aware that the half-dozen clan members who had come to see the signal result were watching. "Thank you," he said, which was inadequate but was what he had. She let go of his arm. "Celebration tonight," she said, turning to address the group behind her. "Clean water for the hold. And the hold, those 400 people who had been drawing from one failing well for 3 years, celebrated accordingly." The celebration in the Darkwolf longhouse was loud and warm and smelled of roasted boar, and the heavy grain mash and pine-sap candles. And someone played a deep-bodied drum, and someone else played a bone flute, and the sound filled the hall and went out through the smoke hole into the highland night. Clyde ate and drank, and was spoken to by more of the clan members in that single evening than he had been in the previous week combined, because a man who had found water for the hold was no longer a foreign body in the hold. He was something the hold needed, which was entirely different. He sat with Dirk and 2 other older orc men, and learned that the valley below the hold had been in a quiet drought cycle for 6 years, that the Darkwolf clan had lost 2 families to a fever the previous winter, because their compromised water supply had run close to a contaminated surface stream, and that Shagrol had been pressing her father for 2 years to bring in a professional digger, and had been told repeatedly that no guild man would come. "She went and got one herself," Dirk said with vast satisfaction, refilling his clay cup. "That is Shagrol. If the mountain will not move, she climbs it. Her father lets her run the trade negotiations." Dirk looked at him. "Chief Grak is old and his joints are bad and his eyes are going. Shagrol runs most things now. She is not officially chief, not yet, but in practice." He made a gesture with his cup that completed the sentence. "Why hasn't the succession been formalized?" Dirk's expression shifted slightly. There are those in the clan who feel the leadership should pass to her cousin Vorg. He is older and was a war captain and has the louder voice. Grak does not press the matter because it would split the hold, and his health is too poor to survive a split. Clyde looked down the long table toward Shagrol, who was pouring grain mash for an older woman with the ease of someone who had grown up doing it, listening to something the woman said with that focused, complete attention he had already begun to recognize as characteristic of her. "What does Shagrol say about it?" he asked. Dirk shrugged. "She says the hold matters more than the title, but a chief who cannot command is no chief at all." He drank. "And Vorg is not a good man." The hold slept late that night except for the watch, and Clyde lay in his forge bunk and stared at the ceiling and thought about seams in stone, and the way water moved through dark places and found its way out eventually. Over the next 8 days, he sank the second shaft. This one was shallower and the rock was friendlier, and without the quartzite surprise, it went faster 44 feet to a clean secondary aquifer that Clyde suspected connected to the same deep fracture system he'd hit in the first shaft, though at a different angle. He finished the second shaft on a clear morning when the frost was still on the rock, and the fjord far below was the color of new iron, and sent up his 3-blast signal, and the hold made the same sound of release and satisfaction it had made before. He spent 2 more days fitting the well frames, timber and stone curbs, iron pulley brackets, rope-end wooden bucket systems, and cleaning, and casing the walls of both shafts with stone slabs to keep the upper soil from contaminating the water. He did all of this with the methodical pleasure of someone who liked finishing work properly, and Shagrol worked beside him for most of it, and the two of them had by now developed a working language that was partly common tongue and partly the comfortable shorthand of people who have done physical labor together long enough that they do not need to name every action before they take it. They argued once, on the second day of fitting the first frame. He wanted to set the pulley bracket at a slightly different angle than she had positioned it, and she was certain her placement was correct, and they went back and forth on it with the blunt honesty of two people who had each decided the other was worth arguing with, which was its own kind of compliment. He was right about the angle, and he knew it, but he did not press the point with more than the evidence supported. She looked at his reasoning, reread the bracket placement herself, and moved it without making a production of being wrong. "Most people sulk when they're wrong," he observed. "Most people waste time sulking," she said, and kept working. On the last evening of his well work, when both shafts were complete and the old shallow wells had been capped and sealed, Chief Grak came out to see the work. He came slowly, leaning on a carved staff, his bulk diminished by age but still formidable, a massive old orc with a gray mane and rheumy eyes, and the kind of scarred, weathered face that told a story of a very long and very hard life. He walked the perimeter of both new wells and let someone lower a bucket and then drank from it, and the crowd of clan members that had gathered around him, nearly the whole hold, it seemed went quiet to hear his verdict. "Good water," he said. His voice was deep and slow, like a big stone rolling. He looked at Clyde. "You did this, human?" "Yes, sir." Grak looked at him for a long moment with eyes that were dim but not stupid. "My daughter bought you. She did. For 40 silver. She got a fair price," Clyde said. Grak made a sound in his throat that was ambiguous and then turned and walked back to the longhouse, and the hold exhaled collectively. Dirk put his arm around Clyde's shoulders again. Several people brought him food he hadn't asked for. He ate it all. Shagrol found him later that evening sitting outside the forge building with his back against the log wall, his tools clean and oiled and packed, bracket tethered close and drowsing. The stars were immense over the highland hold, bright and cold and thick, the fjord reflecting them faintly far below. She sat down beside him, not close but close enough to be deliberate about it. She was out of her usual full gear, having traded the pauldrons for her bodice alone, the laced elk leather following her frame in the firelight from the forge doors. She smelled of wood smoke in the cold night air. "The bond contract runs 1 year," she said. "I know." The well work is complete." She was quiet for a moment. "You have met your labor obligation for the contracted value. By the terms of the bond, we owe you the release of the contract, and the bond is discharged." He turned his head to look at her. "You memorized the contract terms." "Of course I did. Most people wouldn't discharge a labor bond just because the work was done. The year would still run. Most people use bonds as cages," she said. "I used it to get the work done." She reached into the front of her bodice. He resolutely kept his eyes on her face and produced a folded paper. "The discharge document, signed by my father, witnessed by Dirk. You are free." He took the paper. It was heavy, good vellum with the Darkwolf clan mark in pressed ink at the bottom. He looked at it for a moment, then folded it and put it in his coat. "I have nowhere else to be," he said, which was honest. She looked at him. "The second aquifer is going to need monitoring for the first 6 months," he continued. "New shafts can shift in their early period. You'd want someone who knows them to check the casings and the water quality regularly." He paused. "And if the third well starts to turn, you'll need someone on site to cap it before it contaminates the new shafts." "And you are offering this service," she said carefully. "I am offering to stay," he said, "if the hold will have me. As a free man, not a bond, working for fair wages or trade goods." The silence between them was the specific silence that happened when something true was being said without the full truth being said yet. "I would want you to stay," Shagrol said. Her voice was very even. "The hold would benefit from it." He looked at her because she was not the kind of person you looked away from when she was saying something important, and he said, "Is it just the hold?" She was quiet for long enough that the forge coals popped and a log settled in the building behind them. "No," she said. It was very quiet. "It is not just the hold." He did not say anything else, and neither did she. But something had changed between them as cleanly and permanently as a shaft breaking through to clean water. He stayed. He moved his things from the forge bunk to a small structure at the edge of the hold that had been a tool storage. He and Dirk converted it to a proper single room in 2 days, with a fixed bed frame and a proper door and a narrow window that looked down the valley to the fjord. It was small and warm and smelled of pine pitch, and it was his. His days took on the shape of the hold. He worked on water maintenance in the mornings, walking the shafts and testing the casings and monitoring the flow. In the afternoons, he was often pressed into other work by the clan, helping repair the longhouse foundations, which were sinking in one corner, or reinforcing the smoking rack, or working with Dirk at the forge on ironwork. He was competent enough to assist with even if he was not a smith. The hold was a working community with 1,000 daily needs, and a man with practical skills and 2 free hands was never short of purpose. In the evenings, more often than not, Shagrol found him. They talked. It was not the tentative, careful talk of people who were suspicious of each other. It had moved past that quickly, almost without either of them acknowledging it. They talked about the hold and the valley and the water table, and the political situation in the lowlands, and the slow fracture within the Darkwolf clan over the succession question. And they talked about smaller things too, his years on the road, the particular loneliness of being a tradesman who moved from place to place and put down roots in water rather than ground, the holds and farms and towns he had been through, and the people who had hired him and paid him fairly and the ones who hadn't. She talked about growing up as Grak Darkwolf's daughter in a hold that had survived 3 wars with the human border lords in the last generation alone, about the things she had seen and done and was not proud of, and the things she was. About the scar on her face, a border lord's soldier's pike, in the last skirmish before the Veldmar Treaty, when she was 22 and had been fighting since she was 18. About the way the scar had made the Veldmar market men look at her differently, which she was uncertain was better or worse than how they had looked at her before. "I think you're beautiful," Clyde said one evening when she mentioned the scar in passing with the deliberate neutrality she gave to things that still stung. She looked at him sharply. "You do not have to. I'm not being kind," he said firmly. "I said I was a poor liar and I meant it. I think you're beautiful. The scar is part of your face and your face is what it is." She was silent for a long moment. "You say things plainly," she said at last. "I told you that the first day. You did." She touched the scar with one finger briefly, the way she sometimes did without seeming to notice she was doing it. Most people either ignore it or stare. No one has. She stopped. No one has just said it plainly. No. Consider it said, he told her. What happened next was not planned, and neither of them moved toward it as if it were a destination. It was more that they had been approaching each other by degrees for weeks, and one evening it was simply the natural distance. She had come to his room that evening, a thing she had been doing more frequently, sitting on the single stool while he sat on the edge of his bed, their voices easy and low in the firelight. And they had been arguing about the best way to shore the casing in the second shaft, which he maintained was showing a slight lean, and she maintained was within tolerance. He got out his sketch of the casing measurements and spread it on the bed between them to show her the angle he was concerned about, and she leaned over to look at it, and she was very close, and the firelight was warm on her face and her hair was loose. She had undone the braid at some point in the evening which he had noticed and not mentioned, and she looked up from the sketch and found his face about 8 inches from hers. She did not pull back. He did not pull back. He said, very quietly, "Shagrol." "Yes," she said, which was not an answer to a question he had asked but was an answer nonetheless. He kissed her. It was not tentative. He was not a tentative man, and she was not a tentative woman. And the weeks of proximity and honesty and the kind of deep, gathered attention they had been paying each other made tentativeness feel wrong. It was a real kiss, firm and slow and thorough, and she kissed him back with the same directness she gave to everything, her hand coming up and cupping the side of his face with a careful, deliberate tenderness that was wholly at odds with how strong she was, and was therefore more moving than if it had been otherwise. When they broke apart, she looked at him with amber eyes that were darker than usual in the firelight, and her expression was something he had not seen on her face before, open, in a way that had no armor under it. "I have wanted to do that for longer than is dignified," she said. "Likewise," he said. She laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, a real, full laugh, not the ghost of a smile she gave the world. It was low and rich and entirely genuine, and it did more to him than anything else he could remember. She stayed until late that night. They talked until the fire burned low, sitting close now, and when she finally rose to go he stood and she paused at the door and looked back at him with her hand on the frame. "Tomorrow you will check the second shaft casing," she said. "I will. And if the lean is within tolerance, you will admit it." "If it is," he said, "it won't be." She was almost smiling as she went out into the dark. What Clyde had not been fully tracking, in the weeks he had been in the Darkwolf hold, was the political weight of what his presence represented to the clan's internal fracture. He understood it clearly on the morning Vorg Darkwolf presented himself at the central yard. Clyde had heard about Vorg from Dirk, and in the sideways way of hold gossip that reached a new person eventually. He was Grak's nephew, 34 years old, a former war captain who had fought in the border skirmishes and collected the credit for it in ways the people who had fought beside him did not always agree were accurate. He was loud and physical and charming in the way that men are charming when they want things, and a portion of the clan, mainly the older warriors and the families who had benefited from his war captain patronage, supported his claim to the succession over Shagrol's. His objection to Clyde was not about water. He made this clear in the central yard on a clear highland morning, when Clyde was coming back from the second shaft with his test kit, and Vorg intercepted him with 2 of his men at his back. Vorg was bigger than Shagrol, heavier built, with the scarred bulk of a man who had fought a great deal and had mostly won. He looked at Clyde the way men look at things they have decided to move. "The bond is discharged," Vorg said. His common tongue was rougher than Shagrol's, with the clipped edges of someone who had learned it for use rather than understanding. "You have no business in this hold." "The chief's daughter asked me to stay," Clyde said. "Shagrol does not lead this hold." "She does most of the work of leading it," Clyde said. Which seems relevant. Vorg's eyes narrowed. You are a human tradesman on orc land. You dig holes and you sleep in a storage room, and you think you have standing to speak on the succession of the Darkwolf clan. I have standing to say what I've seen, Clyde said steadily. I've been here 2 months. The hold has clean water, the longhouses are in better repair than when I arrived, the second smoking rack is finished, and the valley trade contracts are running well. Most of that is Shagrol's work. I helped where I could. That seems like the right kind of chief to me, but you're right that it's not my clan. Then leave my clan, Vorg said. I'll leave when Shagrol asks me to, Clyde said. Or when Chief Grak asks me to. I don't take orders from someone who doesn't hold the title he's claiming. There was a silence. The 2 warriors behind Vorg shifted. Dirk, who had come out of the forge at some point in the last minute, was standing in the doorway watching. Vorg took a step toward him. He was nearly twice Clyde's mass. You are very confident for a human who digs holes. Digging holes is honest work, Clyde said. He did not back up. And I am confident in proportion to what I know. What I know is that you're not chief yet. What happened next happened fast. Vorg swung at him. It was a big, heavy, angry swing, the kind that would have knocked Clyde's head half off if it had connected. But Clyde had spent years working in confined shafts where the margin for error was 0, and he had developed reflexes suited to his environment. He ducked low and inside the swing, got his shoulder into Vorg's ribs, and drove forward with the leverage of someone who knew how to move weight through rock and stone. It was not enough to put Vorg down. The orc was too heavy and too strong for that, but it knocked him sideways and off balance, which was not nothing. Then everything stopped because Shagrol was in the yard. She had come from the longhouse, moving at a pace that was not quite running, but was faster than anyone who moved that way without hurry. She put herself between Clyde and Vorg with the absolute finality of a door closing, and the physical reality of her presence. Her size and the quality of her stillness and the look on her face stopped the 2 of Vorg's warriors before they had finished deciding whether to move. Touch him again, she said to Vorg, in common tongue so Clyde could hear it, and I will answer for him. This is, Vorg began. This man stays in this hold at my invitation, Shagrol said. He has given this clan water that will last a generation. He has worked alongside every person here with honesty and with skill. He is under my protection. A pause, and then in a voice that was quiet and very final. And I am the chief's daughter, Vorg, and until my father says otherwise, my protection means something in this yard. Vorg looked at her for a long moment. The calculation behind his eyes was visible. He was weighing things, counting supporters, reading the yard. The yard, Clyde noticed, had filled with people. Dirk was still in the forge doorway. Several older women had come out of the longhouse. 3 warriors who answered to Shagrol were visible at the yard's edge. Vorg stepped back. He gave Clyde one last look of pure, undisguised contempt, and then turned and walked. In the silence left behind him, nobody spoke for a moment. Then Dirk said something in Orcish that made 3 people laugh and broke the tension, and the yard went back to its ordinary business. Shagrol turned to look at Clyde. She looked him over, checking for damage. He understood, and the look was swift and practical, and yet entirely tender underneath. He had a bruise forming on his cheek from where Vorg's knuckle had grazed him in the miss. She reached up and touched it, just a fingertip, very lightly. "You are not hurt," she said. It was between a question and a statement. "I'm fine." He covered her hand with his for a moment, briefly, in the middle of the yard with the entire hold around them, and she let him. "Thank you. You should not have stood against him alone. I didn't know you were coming." "I am always coming," she said. "When it matters." He believed her. He also understood, in that moment in the central yard, with the cold highland light coming off the fjord and half the Darkwolf clan watching, that what was between them was not a private thing any longer. It was a public thing, whether they had chosen to make it so or not. The settlement could not stop talking about it. The moment Shagrol Darkwolf, standing between her human well-digger and her cousin's fist, declaring him under her protection in the open yard, ran through the hold like a lit fuse. The version that Dirk told was dramatic and favorable to Clyde. The version the older women told was focused almost entirely on Shagrol's face when she touched his cheek. The version Vorg's allies told was quieter and uglier, but it was outnumbered. It reached Shagrol Darkwolf's ears by evening. Clyde knew it had reached him because he was summoned. Shagrol received him in the longhouse, seated in his carved chair by the fire with a wool blanket over his knees, looking like a weathered mountain that had decided to sit. Shagrol was standing at his right side with the particular careful stillness she used when she was managing herself in a charged situation. Shagrol looked at Clyde for a long time without speaking. Then he said, in slow, deliberate common tongue, "My daughter said you did not run from Vorg." "No, sir. He is much larger than you." "He is. And you are a well-digger." "I am not a warrior." "No," Clyde paused. "But I have spent a lot of years in places that would close on top of me if I made a mistake, and I have learned not to panic in tight spaces." Shagrol looked at him for another moment and then made the ambiguous sound he had made at the wells. Then he looked at Shagrol. "He is direct," Shagrol said. "He is always direct," Shagrol said. "You like this?" She met her father's eyes. "Yes." Shagrol was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, it was in Orcish, addressed to Shagrol, and Clyde did not understand the words. But he watched Shagrol's face, which went very still and then, with slow deliberateness, softened into something that was not quite hope but was in its neighborhood. She replied in Orcish, brief and measured. Shagrol looked at Clyde again. "She says you make her laugh," Shagrol said. Clyde was caught entirely off guard by this. "I try. She does not laugh easily." "I know." Shagrol seemed to weigh something. "Then, the bond contract is done. You are a free man on my land. If you wish to remain, you will remain as a free man. The hold will pay you for your work in trade goods or silver as you prefer." He paused. "And if my daughter wishes to walk the yard with you and the hold does not stop whispering about it, then the hold will eventually find something else to whisper about." Another pause longer. "That is not a blessing. That is an observation." "I understand the difference," Clyde said. Shagrol made the ambiguous sound again, which Clyde was beginning to think might be approval. "Go, drink something." He was dismissed. He walked out of the longhouse into the cold night air with his heart doing something undignified in his chest, and Shagrol fell into step beside him almost immediately. She had slipped out a moment after him, which suggested she had not been planning to stay for whatever conversation Shagrol was going to have with himself next. "What did you say to him?" Clyde asked. "What he translated." "I told him you made me laugh," she said. "There was more than that." She was quiet for a step. "I told him you were the most honest person I had met in a long time and that you looked at me without thinking about what you were supposed to see." He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. The yard was dark and the stars were back, huge and cold overhead, and the longhouse lights were warm squares in the dark. "Shagrol," he said. "Clyde," she said. "I am in a significant amount of difficulty," he said, "with respect to how I feel about you." She turned to face him. In the dark, her amber eyes were steady and warm, and entirely without guard. She reached out and took his hand, his rough, calloused, stone-worn hand in both of hers, and held it with that same careful, deliberate tenderness she had shown him the first time she kissed him. "Tell me," she said. "You are always direct. Be direct now." "I love you," he said. It was very quiet and very simple and very true, and he said it without adornment because she deserved the clean version of things. "I know that is fast, and I know what I am and what you are and the thousand reasons that might make it complicated, and I still love you. That is the honest position." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she brought his hand up and pressed it against her chest, over her heart, and he could feel the beat of it steady and strong and fast. "This," she said, "has been your fault for some time." He laughed, and then she was kissing him in the middle of the dark yard, and it was warm and certain, and it tasted of the wood smoke and cold air of the highland hold. And when they finally broke apart, he was holding her face in both hands, and she was holding his with a care that was proportional to how much she could have crushed it with no effort at all, and neither of them were laughing any more. Vorg did not accept the yard moment quietly. He had allies, and the succession question had been building for years, and the presence of a human well-digger who had declared for Shagrol, and for whom Shagrol had declared, which was a different and more significant thing, became the stone that broke the surface of the deeper water. The crisis came 7 days later, on the morning of the autumn trade muster, the day when the hold's warrior men and women formally renewed their oaths of service to the chief, and by extension, to whoever the chief was visibly favoring to succeed him. Vorg called the muster openly. He stood in the central yard and called it out in a voice loud enough to reach every corner of the hold, using the formal language of the Orc succession challenge, a claim made before witnesses that the current succession arrangement was inadequate to the hold's needs, that a formal trial of leadership should determine the next chief. It was within his rights under Darkwolf clan law. Nobody could stop him from making the call. What he had not predicted was that Grak would answer it personally. Chief Grak came out of the longhouse in full regalia for the first time in 2 years. The heavy wolf-hide mantle, the iron-bound staff, the chief's torque of hammered silver around his neck, and he walked into the yard slowly but without a limp, and the hold assembled around him in the particular silence that happened when the full weight of a long, hard-earned authority was exercised. He looked at Vorg with his rheumy eyes that were not stupid, and he said, in the slow-rolling voice that had not lost any of its mass with age, "I answer you, nephew." What followed was not a fight. It was a formal succession declaration, Grak Darkwolf, chief of the Highland hold, naming his successor before the assembled clan. He named Shagrol. He used the full formal language, the traditional Orcish phrases that Clyde could not understand but whose meaning was entirely clear in the quality of attention every member of the hold was paying them. He put the chief's torque around her neck with both hands while the hold was completely silent. Vorg stood across the yard with his allies and his options narrowing visibly. He made one more move. He pointed at Clyde, who was standing at the edge of the assembled hold with Dirk and who had been trying to stay unremarkable, and he spoke in Orcish for a long, heated moment. Dirk translated quietly in Clyde's ear. He says that the new chief of the Darkwolf clan keeps a human in her yard like a pet, and that this disgraces the hold, and that no warrior will follow a woman who has given her. Dirk paused diplomatically, her personal favor to a bond laborer from the market. Clyde felt the particular cold clarity that came over him in tight situations. He looked at the yard, the assembled hold, Shagrol standing with the torque around her neck, and her expression controlled and hard, Vorg pointing at him with contempt, the gathered warriors and working people and elders all in various stages of deciding what they believed. He stepped forward. He walked through the crowd. People made room, the same way they had made room for Shagrol at the market, though for an entirely different reason, and he stopped in the middle of the yard, between Vorg and Shagrol, which was perhaps not the most sensible place to be but was the honest one. He faced the hold. He did not speak in Orcish because he did not have the language, so he spoke in Common, and Dirk translated from the forge doorway because Dirk was good at knowing when translation was needed. "My name is Clyde Hale," he said. "I was sold at a bond auction 6 weeks ago, and Shagrol Darkwolf bought me for 40 silver and brought me up here to dig wells. That is the true and simple beginning of this." He paused while Dirk translated. "I dug your wells. Your water is clean now, and will be for a generation. I did that work because I was contracted to do it and because it was right, and your new chief stood on the pulley line for 12 days and pulled spoil rock while I dug, and she did it without complaint and without slowness, and she knew everything about the water table under your land that she had not known 3 weeks before I arrived, because she learns everything that concerns the people she protects." Another pause. "I am a free man now, and I am not leaving this hold, not because I have nowhere else to go, but because I do not want to go. Your chief is the finest person I have met in a hard, long road, and I am in love with her, and I am saying so in your yard because I am not a man who lies about what matters to him, and this matters to me more than anything." He let that land. I know I am a human and she is an orc, and some of you think that is impossible or wrong. I think it is neither of those things. I think it is simply true." He looked at Vorg. "I am not a pet. I am a man who has chosen to stand with her." "There is a difference," Dirk translated. The yard was very quiet, then Shagrol spoke. She turned to face her clan with the torque of the chieftaincy around her neck and the scar on her face catching the cold highland light, and she spoke in Orcish in a clear, carrying voice that had never needed to shout to be heard, and even Clyde, who did not know the language, could feel the weight of it in the yard, the directness of it, the absolute refusal to soften or excuse. Dirk did not translate for a moment. Then quietly in Clyde's ear, "She says that she is your chief, and that what she does with her private regard is her own matter, and that no man in this yard has given the hold more loyalty and more skill in 6 weeks than Clyde Hale, and that any warrior who wants to discuss it should discuss it with her personally, which she would find very satisfying." 3 warriors who had been visibly undecided began laughing. The older women in the longhouse doorways were nodding. Several of the younger orc men looked at Clyde with an expression he had not expected: respect, plain and genuine. Vorg looked across the yard at his cousin, who was now the formally named chief of the Darkwolf hold, and at the human man standing in the middle of the yard who had spoken his heart in front of the whole assembled clan and made the final calculation of his position. He had allies. He did not have enough. The muster was over. He left the yard. His allies, one by one, drifted. Some of them would stay in the hold and make their peace with the new chief eventually. Others would leave for other clans, which was also within their rights. The hold would thin slightly and then settle, which is what holds did after transitions. Shagrol Darkwolf went back to the longhouse. At the doorway he paused and looked back at Clyde and made the ambiguous sound for the 3rd time, and Clyde finally decided it was definitely approval. The hold exhaled. Shagrol crossed the yard to him. She did not hurry, but her stride was direct and her amber eyes were fixed on his face, and when she reached him she was very close and the new torque was heavy at her throat, and her expression had shed every armor it had been wearing for the last hour. "You said that in front of everyone," she said. "I said it to everyone," he corrected. "There's a difference. You taught me that one." He looked at the torque. "Chief Darkwolf," her mouth curved. "Do not make me sound more formal than I am." "You are the chief of this hold and the finest woman I have ever known," he said. "Formal is accurate." She looked at him for a moment with that open, unguarded expression she only gave to him. Then she put her hand on the side of his face, the same careful, deliberate touch she had used in the yard after Vorg had taken his swing, and said, quietly so only he could hear, "Come with me." He went. The highland autumn deepened over the next weeks, and the high fjord hold went about the business of transitioning to new leadership and closing out the season. Shagrol's succession was not seamless. There were negotiations to be had, elder warriors to be consulted, trade agreements to be renegotiated, a meeting with the Lower Valley clan that shared the eastern ridge that Clyde sat in on at her request and watched her handle with the same direct, unhurried clarity she brought to everything. She was formidably good at this work. He had always known it. Watching her do it on a formal stage was something else. He continued his maintenance rounds on the wells, and he had been right about the second shaft. The casing lean was outside tolerance, and he spent 3 days resetting it while Shagrol did not say, "I told you so," with her mouth, but said it fluently with her eyes. He told her she was right and resented nothing about it. She was pleased in that private, barely visible way she had of being pleased by him. They were together now in the way that was understood by the whole hold, publicly and without ambiguity. In Orc clan custom, this was not a quiet or gradual thing. The hold accepted it or it did not, and the hold had seen them in the central yard and had made its peace with what it saw. Several of the older women took to greeting him with the particular warmth they reserved for people who had become part of things in the genuine way, which meant more to him than formal acceptance. Dirk gave him a flask of the good mash and a handshake that was more of an arm clasp and said, "Welcome to the hold, Wellman. We will make a Darkwolf of you." Not literally, Clyde said. Not literally, Dirk agreed and poured more mash. He and Shagrol talked about everything. They argued about practical things and agreed on large things, and the large things were the important ones. The idea that people deserved honesty, that work was how you proved what you valued, that a community was the sum of what its people gave to it rather than what they took from it. They did not agree on everything, and neither of them had any interest in a version of each other that agreed on everything. What they shared was the conviction that the truth between them was worth more than the comfort of false smoothness. She told him, one night in the hold with the fire low and the highland wind pulling at the walls, about the raid she had led at 25, a retaliatory strike against a border lord's garrison that had burned an orc supply cache and left 3 clan members dead. She had led the raid herself, with 15 warriors, and they had achieved what they set out to achieve, and she had been the last one out and had held the ground while the others retreated, which was where the pike had found her face. She said it evenly, but he knew her well enough now to hear the things that lived underneath the evenness. "Were you afraid?" he asked. She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she thought about things. When it was happening, no. After yes, for a long time, a pause. I was afraid they had won even though we drove them back, because they had put a mark on me that I did not choose and I could not take off. The scar. Yes. And now, she looked at him. Now I think about it differently. A mark is only owned by the one who put it there if you believe it is. I have decided it belongs to me. He reached out and touched the scar the same way she sometimes touched it herself, lightly, with one finger, along the line from bridge to cheek. She went very still. "It's yours," he said. "Has been for a long time." She covered his hand with hers. She held it there for a moment, and he felt her exhale a deep, slow breath, something releasing that had been held for a long time. "I did not think I would find someone like you," she said. Not in the sentimental way that some people said those words, but in the honest, direct way she said everything, as if it were a fact she had assessed and confirmed. "I had stopped expecting it." "I was not expecting it either," he said. "I was expecting to dig a well and go home." "And now I am home," he said simply. She looked at him for a long moment with those amber eyes that were the warmest thing in the cold highland hold, and then she leaned forward and kissed him with the same conviction she gave to everything. Not gently, not tentatively, but fully and honestly, and without any held-back part of herself. And he put his arms around her and held her the way you hold something you are not planning to let go of. The night she claimed him under orc custom was the last night of autumn before the highland snows came. It was the tradition of the Darkwolf clan, and of many of the highland orc clans, that when a chief took a partner, the claiming was done at the break of the last clear night before the winter closed the holds. It was not a ceremony in the formal human sense. It was a different kind of public truth. Shagrol had explained it to him carefully, sitting in his room 2 nights before, watching his face as she explained it in case the custom troubled him. It did not trouble him. What she described was simple. The chief and her chosen went to the high cliff above the fjord, to the flat stone shelf that looked down over the whole valley and the water and the sky under the last of the autumn stars, and they spoke what was true between them, in front of the night and the mountain and each other and whatever else was listening. No witnesses needed, no documents, no transaction, just 2 people saying the truth of themselves to each other in the open air. "That is not so different from how I think about it," Clyde said. She nodded slowly. "I thought it might not be. There is a second part to the custom," she continued. "The chief gives her chosen a clan mark." She touched her own left wrist where the thin blue tattoo lines ran. "Not the same as mine, a mark of the choosing, a Darkwolf mark." She paused. "It is not obligation, you do not have to accept it." "I want it," he said. She looked at him. "You are certain?" "I am always certain about the things I say yes to," he said. "I told you I don't lie." She reached across and covered his wrist with her hand. "Good," she said softly. The last night of autumn was cold and brilliant. The stars over the high fjord were extraordinary, the kind of sky that only happened at altitude, and only after the air had been cleaned by the first highland frost. Every star distinct and burning. the fjord below the cliffs reflecting them back in silver and black. The forest below the hold was already bare, the black pine branches clean against the sky, and the valley wound away south into the dark lowlands that Clyde had come from, a long road from a bond auction, from a man standing on a platform with rope on his wrists. The shelf above the cliff was a 20-minute climb from the hold. Shagrol led the way without a torch. She had made this climb since childhood and knew it the way Clyde knew the geometry of a shaft. He followed her with his hand torch until she told him to put it out, and then they went by starlight and mountain memory, the stone under his boots solid and cold, the wind pulling at his coat. The shelf was larger than he had expected, a wide flat platform of pale gray granite that jutted out over the cliff edge like a natural balcony, with the fjord 400 feet below and the valley spreading away on all sides, and the hold's lights a warm cluster in the darkness behind them. Standing on the shelf with the full sky above and the full valley below and nothing between them and the horizon but cold air and starlight, Clyde felt the particular physical sensation of being very small inside something very large, and finding that the very large thing was not hostile. Shagrol stood at the cliff edge and looked out over the fjord. Her hair was down fully unbound, falling black and heavy past her shoulders, and the starlight caught the silver of the new chief's torque at her throat. She was wearing her leathers, the charcoal bodice and the riding trousers and the high black boots, and in the cold air and the starlight she looked exactly like herself, which was the most beautiful she ever looked. She turned to him. "No custom speech required," she said. "Say what is true." He came and stood beside her, looking out at the fjord and the stars. He thought about what was true. He was not a man who had ever been good at saying things prettily, but he had learned from her that saying things truly was enough. "I came up this road as a man with no particular place to be," he said. "I have dug wells in 30 valleys and I have put down roots in none of them because I was always the man who went where the water was and then went somewhere else. I thought that was the shape of my life and I had made my peace with it." He looked at her. "And then you paid 40 silver for me and pulled a rope off my wrists and told me you bought work, not rope, and something in me, something that had been quiet for a long time, decided that was the truest thing anyone had said to me in a very long while." He paused. "I love you. I love your directness and your strength, and the way you learn everything that concerns the people you protect, and the way you laugh when something genuinely surprises you, and the way you hold things gently when you could hold them otherwise. I want to stand in this hold for as long as you will have me. I want to dig its wells and fix its frames and argue with you about casing tolerances and sit with you when the fire is low and be the person you say the real things to." He stopped. "That is what is true." She looked at him for a long moment in the starlight. Her expression was the open one, the fully unguarded face she kept only for him and for the dark. "I have been alone inside myself for a long time," she said. It was slow, deliberate, each word placed carefully. "Not without people I have the hold, the clan, my father Dirk, but alone in the place where the real things are, the things you do not say in the yard." She looked at the fjord. "I did not buy you because I was certain of anything. I bought you because you looked at me from that platform and did not flinch, and something in me said, that one. Whatever that means." She looked back at him. "It means this. It means you standing in my yard in the open and saying true things. It means you at the bottom of a 60-foot shaft finding water for my people. It means you touching my scar like it belongs to me." Her voice had gone very quiet. "I love you, Clyde Hale. I have loved you for longer than I acknowledged it, which is an unusual situation for a woman who generally knows her own mind." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Don't," she said, but she was almost smiling. "I would never," he said, and he was definitely smiling. She reached into the front of her bodice and took out a small iron needle case and a tiny clay pot of the dark blue ink, the same ink as her wrist tattoos. She held them out to him, and he held out his left wrist, and she took it in her hands. She worked with the same careful precision she gave to everything. The needle was cold and very fine, and the ink was dark, and she drew 3 thin lines on the inside of his left wrist, not the same as her own marks, but something related, a variant pattern of the Darkwolf clan mark. He felt the sting of each line and did not move his wrist or his eyes from her face. When she was done, she held his wrist in both hands and looked at the marks and then looked up at him. "Claimed," she said simply. "Claimed," he agreed, which was not a word he had ever imagined applying to himself and which felt entirely right. Then she put the needle case away and stepped forward, and he took her face in his hands, marked wrist and clean wrist both, and she put her arms around him, and they stood together on the cliff shelf above the Darkwolf fjord under 400 feet of cold, brilliant, star-filled sky. He kissed her. She kissed him back with everything she had, which was considerable. She was a woman who did not do things by halves and had never done things by halves in her life, and what she gave was full and real and warm, the warmth of someone strong and guarded who had opened the guard for one person only. He held her close in the cold air, the fjord and the valley falling away below them, the hold's lights warm in the darkness behind, the stars above the mountain doing what stars do, burning, patient, entirely indifferent to small human matters, and yet somehow entirely appropriate as a backdrop for them. They stayed on the cliff shelf for a long time. They talked and were quiet and talked again, and looked at the fjord below and the sky above and at each other in the easy way of people who have run out of things to hide from each other and find it a relief. He told her about the road, the real version, not the summary. The years of moving from job to job, valley to valley, never quite making enough to put down roots, never quite finding a place that wanted him enough to make putting down roots feel worth it. The loneliness of it that he had managed by being good at the work and not thinking too hard about the rest. She listened to all of it with that complete, undivided attention that was one of the most intimate things about her. When he finished, she said, "You were always looking for water." He looked at her. "Every well you dug," she said, "you were looking for a place where the water was clean and deep and you could stay." She paused. "You found it." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I found it." She looked out at the fjord one more time, and then she turned and took his hand, his left hand, the marked one, and led him back down the cliff toward the warm lights of the hold. The snows came the next day, as the highland autumn always kept its promise. The pass road below the hold closed within a week, which was fine. Clyde had no intention of using it. He was exactly where the water was, in the highland hold above the deep fjord, with clean shafts sunk 60 feet through good granite, and the chief of the Darkwolf clan asleep beside him in the dark, her hand warm over his marked wrist, the night wind moving through the black pines outside, and the stars burning cold and steady overhead. The hold settled into winter. The longhouses were warm with bodies and fires, and the stored wealth of a good autumn's trade, and the 2 new wells fed the hold clean and steady through the early freeze when surface water became unreliable. He walked the well lines every morning in the first thin snow, checking the frames and the pulley lines and the winter casings he had built to keep the shafts from freezing, and the water came up cold and clean every time, which was the professional satisfaction that had never gotten old. Shagrol led the hold. She did it the way she did everything, with directness and patience, and the complete attention she gave to whatever was directly in front of her. And the hold felt it, the way a hold feels when the person at its center is the right person. Grack remained in his chair by the fire, consulted on matters of memory and tradition, his health holding steady through the early winter, and he watched his daughter run the hold with the expression of a man who has handed something precious to someone who will not drop it. Vorg had taken 3 of his closer allies and gone south before the pass closed. The hold did not fall apart without them. Holds rarely fell apart from losing the people who would have broken them. Dirk made Clyde a pair of proper highland boots for the winter, iron-fitted and thick-soled. A craftsman's gift that carried a great deal of meaning without requiring words. The older women of the hold brought him food he had not asked for on a regular basis, and corrected his orcish pronunciation with cheerful ruthlessness when he attempted it, which he was attempting increasingly, because it seemed like a reasonable thing to do in a hold where most of the children spoke better common than he would ever speak their language, but where the attempt mattered. On a deep winter evening, when the snow was 3 feet on the flat, and the fjord below was a white and silver silence, Shagrol came to him where he was sitting outside the forge under the deep eave. A habit he had of sitting outside even in cold weather because he was a man who had spent his life in open air and could not quite shake the need for sky, even in winter. She sat beside him and they looked out at the snow-covered valley and the fjord and the distant white mountains on the far side of the water, and she said nothing for a while, and he said nothing for a while, which was the most comfortable thing in the world. Then she said, "Last spring I went to the Veldmar market and the collector had a man on a platform and I looked at him and I thought that one." He looked at her. "I did not know what it meant," she said. "I told myself it was the guild certification and the need for a well-digger." Her mouth curved slightly. "I was lying to myself." "What did it mean?" he asked, though he knew. "It meant I saw you," she said simply. "The real version, before you said a word." She paused. "A man who was not afraid. Who was in a bad situation and was not afraid of it and not pretending not to be afraid. Who looked at me and looked back." She was quiet. "I have been looked at in many ways. Not many of them as honestly as that." 40 silver was a lot, he said. "You were worth more," she said, without any particular drama. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Best thing that ever happened to me." She looked at him sideways. "Being auctioned. Being bought by you," he said, "specifically." She made the low, rich laugh, the real one, the one that had been his since the first time he heard it, and leaned against him, her weight warm and solid in the cold air. And he put his arm around her, and they sat together under the forge eave in the deep highland winter with the whole white valley below them, and the stars beginning to emerge above the far peaks, and the hold behind them going about the warm, steady business of being alive. He was not a man with property or rank or name. He was a well-digger from the flatlands with calluses on his hands, and a mule named Bracket, and a year of road behind him. He had been sold on a platform in a fog-burning market for 40 silver marks, and had climbed a highland road in the wake of a woman who had not bought him gently, but had bought him with intent, and had stood in a yard full of people, and claimed him as worth her protection before she had ever let him see that she would come to love him. And she did love him. She showed it the way she showed everything, directly, without ornament, with the fullness of someone who had been guarded for a long time and had opened the gate all the way once she had decided to open it at all. She wanted him. She had chosen him. She kept choosing him, every day in the hold and every night in the dark, over every other possible version of a life she could have led. That was the thing he had never expected and would not waste by taking it for granted. The mark on his wrist had healed into clean blue lines, fine and permanent, the Darkwolf choosing mark. He looked at it sometimes in the working day briefly between one task and the next at the forge or on the well line or in the longhouse common, and felt a precise, wordless, deep-seated peace. He was known here. He was needed here. He was loved by the finest person he had ever encountered, who feared nothing and was stronger than him in most practical respects, and who had looked at him on a platform in a fog-burning market, and thought that one, and had put 40 silver on the block without blinking. He had been the man who went where the water was and never stayed. He had gone where the water was one last time, and the water was clean and deep and would not run out, and he was staying. Shagrol's hand found his in the dark under the forge eave, warm and certain, the way her hands had always been, strong enough to pull an 80-pound bucket 60 feet up a granite shaft without slowing, and careful enough to ink 3 fine lines on a man's wrist by starlight without shaking. He held on. The snow fell soft and steady on the highland hold, and the fjord lay white and silver below, and the stars above the far peaks burned cold and patient and entirely correct. He was home.